Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Tonight we're going to be talking about Divine Hiddenness. And in the previous interviews I've done on Divine Hiddenness, there's a response that I haven't heard come up, and that is the response that my guest, Dustin Crummett, is going to be defending tonight. It's a really neat solution to at least some of the problems that Divine Hiddenness presents. So welcome again, Dustin. You've been on my channel at this point at least 4 other times, I think, 3 or 4 other times. So you've become a pretty regular guest. Welcome back.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And the paper that we're going to be discussing here is from 2015. So it's been a while. And
yeah,
you had to refresh your memory by looking back at
it. You might know the content better than I do at this point. It was the first paper I ever published, so it's been so long since I wrote it.
So the paper is completely free. I've linked it in the description of this video, and it is called "We Are Here to Help Each Other: Religious Community, Divine Hiddenness, and the Responsibility Argument." The key word there is responsibility argument. That's the argument you develop in response to the problem of divine hiddenness. So by the end of the video, you're going to know what this argument is and how Dustin has modified it from the way that others have used it and developed it in new ways to avoid certain objections. Okay, so let's begin just by you telling me, you said this is the first paper you ever wrote on. So how did you come to do that? What got you interested in hiddenness and writing a paper on it?
Well, so, I was an undergraduate when I had the idea for this paper. I remember the specific moment when I had it, actually. I was pulling into the garage. I forget where I had been, but I was pulling into the garage and I had the idea for this paper. I'd been thinking about the problem of hiddenness and the problem of evil to which it's related for a long time. That was what I wrote my undergraduate thesis on. So I started working on this paper, and then I realized, I came up with this idea independently, and then I realized Richard Swinburne and Travis Dumsday had both said similar things. But it was good that I came up with it independently, because then I realized some of the things that I had developed were different from what they said in ways that I thought were important and represented improvements and helped solve certain problems. So that's what I wrote. I wrote a version of it the summer after my senior year of undergrad, and then I think it was 2 years later or so that a later version wound up getting accepted. But
okay, well, as briefly as you can, because we're going to unpack this over the course of the interview. What is the core idea of the responsibility argument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Will people know what the problem of divine hiddenness says?
Oh, yeah. Let me say that first. So why don't you go ahead and first lay out hiddenness?
Yeah. So, the problem of divine hiddenness basically is the problem of, look, if God exists, God wants a relationship with us. God wants to believe that he exists. God wants us to do various things. God wants us to feel his presence, whatever. Why is all this not more like straightforward and obvious, right? God could send an angel to be on your YouTube channel. God could write out messages in the stars, could tweet out things, and he'd have the blue check so you know it's really him. Could do all sorts of stuff, right? And yet actually the situation in which we find ourselves is one where, lots of people don't believe in God. Sometimes it seems like they've honestly investigated the matter. Maybe they used to believe in God and losing faith was very painful for them. It doesn't seem like they were biased or whatever. Or, they don't believe in God because they're just from some culture where there's no concept of a monotheistic God or whatever. And that hardly seems like it's their fault. Among people who believe in God and even people who are Christians, there are all sorts of debates about what God wants us to do. We know that people have made all sorts of terrible errors about what God wants us to do throughout history. There are people who, really bad things happen and they don't feel God's presence in their life. They don't feel comfort. They just feel silence. And so hiddenness, as I think about it, is this problem. Why isn't God's existence more obvious? Why isn't what God wants us to do more obvious? Why isn't God's presence easier to feel? My cat has just jumped up. My cat is not hidden, right? He makes his existence very obvious. And so that's the problem of hiddenness. And atheists will think, I've got an easy solution, that God's not more obvious because he doesn't exist, right? But even theists might think, well, this is kind of puzzling. I wonder why things are that way.
Okay, good summary. So now you have a response to the problem of divine hiddenness called the responsibility argument. So what's the core idea of the responsibility argument?
Yeah. So the core idea of the responsibility argument, and this is something that shows up in responses to the problem of evil too, is the idea that us having responsibility for one another, the ability to freely exercise responsibility for one another, is a good thing, right? It gives us a way to manifest our agency. It gives us a way to form deeper relationships with one another, to serve God, to form a deeper relationship with God. And the responsibility argument suggests, maybe one of the things that God has given us responsibility for is one another's spiritual development. It's up to us to kind of collectively help each other learn about the fact that God exists and that God wants us to do certain things and to learn how to feel God's presence, this sort of thing. And so it may be because we sometimes neglect our duties or we do things that are incompatible with them. We do things that make it harder for other people to experience God's presence, harder for them to take the existence of God seriously, whatever. It might be that you wind up with non-belief, say, for which that person isn't culpable, but for which somebody is culpable. It's just somebody else who, should have done things differently. And so the basic thought is maybe hiddenness results because we flaunt some of our obligations.
Is there scriptural support for this type of response?
I think so. Or at least, there's nothing in the Bible that's like, by the way, this is the response to the problem of divine hiddenness. But there are things that suggest that we have this sort of responsibility for one another, that God set up a community that's supposed to teach people important things about God and about how to relate to God, that there are these warnings against, not everybody should be a teacher because that means you're now accountable for the well-being of these other people. And if you mess it up, then that's on you. And so there are certainly, I think, passages that suggest that we have responsibility for one another, coming to knowledge of God and developing spiritually. It doesn't directly say that's the answer to the divine hiddenness problem, but it's pretty natural to think, okay, well, if God has given us this responsibility, it seems like probably some reason for that. And,
Yeah. I think in the paper you mentioned some passage in Matthew. I should have written it down, but there were a couple of passages that in particular that you bring up that seem to fit well with this type of response.
Yeah, there are a couple passages. I have the paper here. I guess I could find. I like I said, it was so long ago, I can't remember.
Yeah.
So I quote, the Great Commission, the various condemnations of religious leaders for laying burdens on other people. Again, this passage, I think it's in James, maybe. In James, that not everybody should become a teacher. I quote a couple passages, and it's also just, in general, it's pretty obvious in the Bible that God wants you to let go, tell other people. God set up this community that's supposed to maintain, certain truths, teach people about them. So,
Okay, so now we know what the problem is, the basic idea of this response. There's some scriptural support for it. What are some of the ways that you think we can positively or negatively influence others' spiritual development?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, one of the ways we can positively do it is through like what you're doing in your YouTube channel, right? Or through what I do in some of my professional life. We're doing work in philosophy and apologetics, trying to, come up with convincing arguments for theism or figure out, what the most plausible interpretation of some doctrine is or of some ethical command or blah, 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 doing theology. And then, doing the academic work and then trying to disseminate it to people and all that sort of stuff. But of course, for a lot of people don't come to religious belief through those sorts of methods, right? They come to religious belief because, they felt God's presence in some community or something like that. And we can do that sort of thing too. I mean, we can, allow other people to see God working through us. We can help encourage them in spiritual disciplines. All sorts of stuff, right? Just all the stuff you normally think you ought to be doing anyway. And then on the other hand, you can harm other people's spiritual development, partly again through anti-intellectualism or, refusing to take seriously, blah, 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 or whatever, but also, through, think about, religious leaders who engage in sexual misconduct and totally discredit themselves and cause massive harm to all these people. All these. There's a historian, Alec Ryrie, who has a book, the name of which escapes me right now, but he basically argues like the reason that there was this big shift away from traditional religion during the Enlightenment is not really because of science or philosophy or whatever. It's because the church was perceived to have lost its moral authority. And then once people no longer felt like you should like morally take these guys seriously, then it's much more appealing to look at, well, there got to be arguments that knock down these people who are really just using their positions to exploit people and all this kind of stuff. There are all sorts of ways in which people use religion harmfully in ways that discredit their witness and that sort of thing. So it's a very expansive, and this is one of the ways in which what I say differs from what Swinburne and Dumsday say. It's really a very expansive conception because I think there are a huge number of things that go into what people wind up thinking and how they wind up developing spiritually and stuff. And so a lot of stuff that's not just what we're doing can be relevant to this too.
Yeah. That was one thing that I appreciated about this paper, and this will come up more in a moment when we contrast the way you develop the responsibility argument with Swinburne and Travis Dumsday. Yours is this very broad, it encompasses a lot of ways that we can influence others' spiritual development. Whereas it seems like the way that Swinburne and Travis Dumsday have in mind is much more narrow. I don't know that they would deny what you're saying. It's not clear to me.
Yeah, and they even will, you'll find like a footnote where they're like, oh yeah, you can do this too, or Swinburne's like, and they're also, you can go to a prayer group and pray for conversions or something. You can preach. So no, and actually, Dumsday commented on, I think this might have been the second conference I ever presented at. Dumsday commented on my paper and he said like, well, I don't disagree with any of this other stuff, and I was like, yeah, fair enough. Like I just emphasize it more and try to develop it more. I make it a much bigger deal. Whereas in them, it's kind of a more latent kind of offhand.
The immediate appeal of broadening it is it seems to capture more of what your average Christian thinks about.
Yeah.
They might not, hopefully the average Christian would see some value in doing philosophy and developing these kinds of arguments. Some may not, but hopefully they would see some value in that. But they themselves might not be like, yeah, I'm developing those arguments. I'm studying that stuff and I'm trying to get the message out. Instead, probably they're thinking, I'm going to, try to live a virtuous life. I'm going to try to be more like Christ, and I'm going to tell people about the gospel and so on. And you're capturing that So I'm grateful you developed it in this way.
Yeah, I mean, philosophers, the natural inclination to any problem is your first response is always going to be like, well, if we just teach people about this philosophical argument I have, then, but that's there are limitations to that. Not that there's anything wrong with it.
Okay, so it seems like this, if you place responsibility on us for the spiritual development of others, there seem to be some natural implications for the afterlife. So can you spell those out?
Yeah. So I think there's a deeper divide that people in the literature talk about between accommodationist and non-accommodationist responses to the hiddenness problem. So the accommodationist, what they're accommodating is the claim that there are people who are like reasonably mistaken, or non-resistantly non-mistaken. Whereas the non-accommodationist says, no, everyone who doesn't have the truth is somehow it's their own fault. Somehow they're refusing to acknowledge the truth, or God hasn't revealed himself to them because they would just rebel even harder then, or, whatever it is, right? Any accommodationist response is going to raise this question about, well, so if you think that like absolutely everybody who doesn't have the right beliefs at the moment that they die, if they are damned, and you think there are some people who don't have the right beliefs and it's not their fault, then like, are some people going to get damned and they just didn't get a fair chance to be saved? And like, that doesn't seem very good, right? So any accommodationist is going to have something to say about those sorts of folks, not just the responsibility people, but any accommodationist, right? And there are different things you could say. I mean, if you're a universalist, then it's going to be easier, right? Because you think everybody gets saved in the end. You could think that some people get a post-mortem second chance. Maybe after they die, things get explained to them. They have some other chance to make a decision. You could think there's this short story called Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge that some people might have read when they were in high school or something. But this guy is being hung, and the rope breaks and he starts to flee, and he has this big adventure. And then at the end you realize, like, no, the rope didn't break. All this has just been happening in his mind, and like the second right before his neck snaps and he dies. Maybe that happens. Maybe, time really subjectively slows down a whole lot, and you get a fair chance to respond in like that last moment before death. Maybe you're just judged based on what you did with the information you had, everybody, I mean, this is a general problem, even apart from the specific problem of hiddenness that we're talking about. I mean, everybody has thought about, what about people in some country who've never heard of Jesus before, and that sort of thing. Everybody has to have something to say about that. And then whatever you think the best thing to say about that is, maybe you can just import that into, what the accommodationist is going to have to say about this sort of worry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe the only thing I'll add there is, I know some people, I've had like long conversations with some people who feel an immense sense of pressure / guilt if they don't evangelize, because they feel like blood is on their hands. That's a term they've used before. And I think it comes from some passage actually in, what was it? Maybe in Ezekiel, there's like a watcher or something like that. And it's like, if you don't call out to the city or something, then the blood's on your hands. So it's like, the idea is, if I'm not constantly telling people about the gospel, then I am the reason they end up going to hell. Now, your answer is, well, the same kind of moves you make for the unevangelized, you could say about that person. And more could be said on that, but I don't know. You can add to that if you want, or we can keep moving on.
It's also, I mean, if I'm right in thinking that there are a lot of things you can do that sort of somehow or other contributes to like an epistemic environment that's favorable to theism, we might say, then it's not just evangelism, it's also other good things. I do think that, morality is demanding, and maybe, our religious obligations are just really demanding. But I mean, I think I agree with what you just said.
Okay. All right, we'll keep moving here. So what are some of the major ways your version of the responsibility argument differs from Swinburne and Dumsday. We hinted at this. You can add to what we said if you want.
Yeah, so the one thing is just, and again, it's not like this is a disagreement, but it's just sort of a way in which I maybe develop it or emphasize certain things more. One way is the focus that I put on things other than just like explicit evangelism and developing philosophical arguments and this sort of stuff. You can do it by participating in prayer groups. You can do it by helping other people in general, by participating in worship collectively, this kind of thing. And then one thing is they sort of, and again, this might not be a real disagreement, but I sort of frame it as like a collective endeavor that everybody can participate in to some extent. It might even be that, say, there are some atheists who, by criticizing harmful forms of religion, can make a positive contribution to this project. They might not think of it as that's, they might not think that that's what they're doing, right? Because they don't think that God exists. So they don't think they're going to help people develop a better relationship with God or something. But it might be that, in fact, that's what they do. So, they sort of portray it as they're the people who have the right religion, and then they have the responsibility to go help the other folks. And that's kind of the way it works. And Paulo, I say, it could be that people, even with, it could be that everybody has some role to play in this project, even if, they're badly mistaken in certain ways. And that kind of helps maybe with some of the stuff that Schellenberg says as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that point about how non-believers can actually still positively help the spiritual development of others by pointing out flaws in arguments and leading you closer to truth. Or even, it's not like non-believers can't. There certainly are philosophers who are not theists, but they've developed arguments for theism and say, these are good.
Yeah.
I don't think these on balance, make it overall probable that God exists, but these seem like a good reason. So yeah, there's ways that they can contribute as well. Yeah. That's basically, now we've got a sketch of the responsibility argument. Schellenberg, who developed the hiddenness argument, has responded to Swinburne and Dumsday's versions of the responsibility argument. I don't know. Did he ever publish? I didn't look into this. Did he ever publish any kind of response to you that you're aware of?
No, I think I'm listed on his CV as people have responded to me. So I think he knows that I wrote that, but I don't think he's ever written anything specifically responding to me. Yeah. He probably thinks that what he already said addresses it, would be my guess. But
okay, so we're going to try and go through some of Schellenberg's criticisms and see how your version of the responsibility argument can answer those criticisms. Okay, so first, he talks about that he says we don't have the necessary tools to have this kind of responsibility. So can you elaborate on that and explain how you respond?
Yeah, so he's thinking the argument works in the way that Dumsday and Swinburne kind of, the main thrust of the way that they suggest that it works. Like, what needs to happen is, people develop arguments for theism and then, go and preach them to other people, and that will convert people to theism. That's kind of thing. And Schellenberg thinks, well, look, but there are really smart philosophers who have heard your arguments for theism and haven't been convinced. So even if God exists, these philosophical and apologetical arguments, they don't convince all reasonable people who look into it honestly, and blah, blah, blah. And so, even if they're good arguments, they don't convince absolutely everybody who honestly investigates. And so aren't there still going to be people who, through no fault of their own, wind up not believing because, it's just philosophical arguments are not powerful enough to convince all reasonable people who look into them outside of very special cases. And this is an area where I think my focus on a broader series of mechanisms helps. Because again, I think just empirically, it just is kind of obviously true that like religious people misbehaving causes people to be less inclined to be religious, for instance, right? It seems obviously true that if religious communities really lived up to all of their ideals, that people would find it easier to be religious, that they would have an easier time figuring out what God really wants them to do, that would people in them would have an easier time feeling God's presence. All that seems quite obvious to me. And so, I think once we incorporate this larger picture of the mechanisms, it certainly is the case that we have the ability to eliminate a lot of hiddenness. Could we eliminate all of it? Who knows, right? Like if the whole history of Christianity had been different, how would things be? I don't know, but at least you can explain a lot of hiddenness in this way. If it turns out that we don't have the mechanisms, and we never had the mechanisms to eliminate all of it, it could be that there's some other explanation of some instances of hiddenness that we have to invoke in those cases. And that wouldn't be the end of the world. If we can explain a lot of it, then I think that's pretty good.
Okay, the second type of criticism that Schellenberg raises is temporally and spatially isolated non-theists. So explain that one and how you respond.
Yeah, so people who are separated by space or time or both from any theists, right? People who live in some far-flung area 5,000 years ago, who never even hear about theism. It never even occurs to them that there could be this single all-powerful God. Maybe they just believe in nature spirits or whatever. Schellenberg thinks, look, there's nothing at all that anybody could do about them, right? Like, how are the theists can't even get to them. And so, like, what's the deal with that? Again, there are a couple of things to say. One is just, well, okay, if my response can solve these other cases, then that's something. Can we say anything about spatially and temporally isolated non-theists? Well, first of all, it could be that, they can still have like better and worse, more or less accurate sets of beliefs, even if they're badly mistaken about some things. And so they might have the ability to exercise important kinds of responsibility, given the light that they have, so to speak, right? Some Viking who thinks like, maybe like human sacrifice isn't that great, or whatever. Maybe he could be like a real spiritual genius and help people out, even if he doesn't get to monotheism or whatever. But also, I think, traditionally Christians have believed in some sort of fall. There are questions about how to square a historical fall with what we might believe from science and history and blah, blah, blah. But if there was something like that happened, maybe that's why there wound up being spatially and temporally isolated non-theists to begin with. So maybe there wasn't anything we could do about it by the time that situation arose, but maybe if things had gone better in the beginning, that situation wouldn't have arisen to begin with. And so it might be that the responsibility account can handle these sorts of cases via appeal to some sort of primordial fall of human beings or beings or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting response. Yeah, in that case, then the responsibility for these spatially and temporally isolated individuals would be on either that first couple, or however you make sense of that story.
Yeah, whatever the
fall on those
historical implementation of fall was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the third type of criticism Schellenberg raises is that, and this is probably the one that this is the most natural one for me to raise. The overwhelming value of relationship with God far surpasses other goods, whatever other goods, like this kind of responsibility for others' spiritual development. Yeah, that's good that you can contribute something to the spiritual development of others. That is a good. But the good of having a relationship with God just is way better than that. So God wouldn't go this route. He wouldn't pick giving you responsibility over for sure you having a relationship with him. I hope I've characterized that correctly. That's how
that's basically what he thinks. And he thinks this basically kind of automatically defeats any response to the hiddenness problem, because it's just relationship with God is so much more important than everything else that just nothing that we know in advance, nothing you cite to justify hiddenness is going to justify hindering people's relationships with God through hiddenness, right? So one thing to say, there are people, Schellenberg is assuming you need to believe that God exists in order to have a relationship with God. There are people who have come up with clever cases where that might not be true. If I'm in a prison cell and someone starts passing notes through like a little crack, and they say that they're the prisoner in the next cell, and I think this is just, the jailers are playing mind games with me. This is some torture thing. So I don't believe this person exists, but I think I'll write back just in case. I'm going to start going. It might be that I develop a relationship. If the person is real, it might be that I develop a relationship with the person while believing that they don't exist, right? Maybe afterwards, we get let out and I find out the person was real, and I think, oh wow, back when we were talking to each other, I didn't even think you were real. It could be that some people can have a relationship with God without believing that he exists, or while having wildly mistaken views about him or whatever. Even apart from that, on my view, it's not that God is forever foreclosing the possibility of a relationship with them, right? Maybe hiddenness delays a relationship in some cases, but God will make sure that there's a fair opportunity for one later on. Maybe that's satisfactory. And it might also be that, part of what I want to say about the responsibility stuff is that it might deepen our relationship with God in certain ways, right? To be able to serve God and one another in this really important way, to maybe form relationships with other people who serve us in this way. That might, in the long run, deepen our relationship with God too. And so, it's very important for Schellenberg that what matters is not only it's not just that God wants a relationship with anybody, but it's that God wants a relationship with everybody this second, and nothing could possibly justify delaying it 1 second. Nothing at all. That's not clear to me at all. That doesn't follow just from the claim that relationship with God is this overwhelming good. It might be that the relationship in some way could be strengthened if it's delayed for 1 second. Or it could be, so
it seems like
he wants super, super strong premises, because he wants this to be basically like a logical proof that God doesn't exist. And I think once you really stop and pause and ask how you think about how strong the premises have to be, they just don't seem very plausible anymore.
I hope I can express this clearly when you said that. So when I've interviewed Liz Jackson, at some point she's mentioned this example in an interview. I can't recall which one, but when we think about, say, the afterlife and having this relationship with God, the quality of that relationship could be like, every day is like eating like a really good food, like a food that you really like. However, whatever state you're in when you're eating that good food, you're like, and that's like, that would be your relationship with God there, or the quality of your relationship with God. Contrast that with, say, you're in the afterlife having a relationship with God, but the experience you're having is like the joy you felt on, say, your wedding day. Okay, well, the joy I felt on my wedding day was way better than the joy I felt eating that, sandwich or whatever, my favorite food. So it seems like you have to take the quality of the relationship into account. And if God can delay to get a higher quality later, then that might be where, it doesn't seem like he just has to go immediately for, I need a relationship now, if going for it immediately now means it's not going to be as deep as it could be if I delayed it. I don't know. That's the thought. Okay, so I think we got 2 more criticisms from Schellenberg. One is, I guess this is the fourth one. So he says, is this too much responsibility for us? Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So that might be, I mean, if you held a view on which this meant that, say, some people got damned because they just didn't get a fair chance because somebody didn't talk to them or whatever, maybe that would be too much responsibility, right? Maybe it wouldn't be worth it at that point. And then maybe that's one reason why I think, well, maybe we don't have that kind of responsibility, right? Maybe God will make sure the person gets a fair chance eventually if they don't right now. But I think in general, this too much responsibility worry, I mean, I don't know. Like, there's always, if you think that responsibility is valuable, but responsibility also necessarily, like a corollary to it is that we might abuse the responsibility, so bad things might happen. There's always going to be a trade off between the goods of responsibility and the risks that you run. You could imagine a world where, like, yeah, God's given us spiritual responsibility for one another's spiritual development. This is how we can try to figure out whether Molinism is true. And that's it, right? Like, everything else God takes care of directly. But we can argue about whether Molinism is true. Well, that would have advantages, right? That would eliminate all the problematic kinds of hiddenness. But, like, the responsibility would be pretty meager then too, right? I mean, whether people believe that Molinism is true is not that important. And so the very thing that makes it not a big problem if people get the wrong answer is also the thing that makes the responsibility kind of piddly. So yeah, I mean, I guess God has to kind of figure out like a reasonable trade-off between risks and value. And there might be a range of reasonable trade-offs. I don't say that God had to do it exactly this way, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just not convinced that this isn't, that we know that this can be a reasonable trade-off, particularly if we think about some of the ways in which, maybe, again, if this can, some of the relationships we build through this way can carry on into the afterlife and have eternal good consequences in exchange for some sort of temporary problem, well, then maybe we'll be really happy, even if some of the consequences were pretty bad.
Okay, last criticism here that we'll talk about from Schellenberg, and that is, I think in the paper you say this is his best criticism. You think this is the best one?
That's what I thought at the time.
Okay, so maybe now you're like, it's in the same boat as the others. I don't know. So he says the responsibility argument violates God's concern for particular individuals.
Yeah. So he's thinking, and he's thinking this because of his reading of the way Swinburne does it. He's thinking, like, look, what's supposed to be of great value is you taking responsibility for other people. That's of great value to you. And he's thinking the way the account works is some people have the truth, and then they have the responsibility to go get the truth to other people. And so really what God is doing is giving some people a benefit, this great responsibility for others, at the expense of some other people who wind up being hidden from, so that other people can decide whether they want to help them or not. And he's thinking there's something objectionable about that, right? About just hosing some people so that other people get the chance to display virtue or whatever. And what I say, and Dumsday talks about a few things like this, but what I say is this is one way in which this idea that this is an endeavor to which everybody can contribute in some ways might help, because it's not just you have some people exercising responsibility for others, but maybe everybody to some extent has the ability to do it, to benefit from that, to serve God, even unbeknownst to them, maybe to serve God, serve other people, form other deep relationships with other people through this sort of stuff. It may also be, maybe people get post-mortem opportunities to help. I don't know, in the afterlife or from the afterlife, or it could be maybe people ultimately in the afterlife, even if you never got to exercise any responsibility, maybe the fact that you have this close-knit community where some people did, and like they have close relationships with God and with each other, maybe that can also benefit you. You can kind of participate in that relationship by getting to know them. And so basically, I think the best way, I mean, there's this general question about, is it really always wrong to like let a bad thing happen to one person to benefit somebody else? And I think it can't always be wrong. So you could just question the moral principle he's relying on. But I think really the best thing to do is just to say, well, no, maybe in the end everybody will be glad that things were done in this way. So it's not that some people are getting hosed.
All right, so we've reached the end, and before I ask you this question, I'll say this to the viewer. So thanks for watching so far, and if you've liked the video, give it a like, consider subscribing to the channel. Also, if you value the content that I'm producing here, which will include more animated videos, I'm working on those as we speak. If you value that content, then please consider becoming a patron. You can do that by clicking the link in the description below. While I ask Dustin this last question, you can, if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the live chat. Just put the word question at the beginning so it's easy for me to find. Okay, here's my last question for you, Dustin. Can you summarize in 60 seconds, if possible, so I can turn it into a short, this response? How does the responsibility argument work as a response to the problem of divine hiddenness?
The responsibility argument suggests that we have responsibility for one another's spiritual development, for one another coming to know about God, know about what God wants from us, learn how to relate to God, develop spiritual disciplines. It suggests that we can do this by investigating philosophical questions and trying to disseminate the results, that sort of stuff, but also by modeling, being a good witness in our lives, by developing close-knit communities where people can feel God's presence more effectively, by doing a whole wide range of things that are part of a good religious life. Or on the other hand, we can hurt other people's ability to figure this stuff out and relate to God by, using religion to exploit people and doing all sorts of bad things, right? And it suggests that, it's good that God has given us this sort of responsibility, but it suggests that sometimes we don't exercise it properly, and that is why hiddenness occurs, or at least a big reason why hiddenness occurs.
Excellent. All right, we've got one question here from Wesley. What do you think of the argument that God doesn't reveal himself because he wants to minimize the guilt of people who would reject him?
Yeah, so I guess that would be like a non-accommodationist response. That would suggest, look, the people who don't believe in God wouldn't respond appropriately even if they knew that God existed, and that's why God doesn't do it. I don't know, there could be cases like that, and that might explain, in those cases, why God doesn't reveal himself. It seems to me that there are cases where people are just genuinely mistaken, even though they really tried their best to figure it out or whatever. I mean, from my perspective, they're genuinely mistaken, even though they tried their best to figure it out. I guess if my perspective is wrong, then I'm genuinely mistaken. So some people are genuinely mistaken, and so it doesn't explain those cases. I mean, it could be, some of the ways that God could reveal himself, I guess, would have to kind of work for everybody, if he wrote stuff in the stars. But there are other things. I mean, he could give people super convincing religious experiences or something and just not give them to the other people who are going to respond badly. And so it seems to me that could be true in some cases, but probably not the solution to everything.
Okay, second question here from Justin Mooney. Is there a problem of hiddenness involving non-human animals? And on that note, what is Dustin's favorite non-domestic animal?
Yeah, is there a problem of hiddenness for non-human animals? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Faith Paul has a paper where I think she argues that non-human animals can have a relationship with God. Yeah, maybe they can. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they do. Maybe they all do. How would we know? I don't know. My cat is asleep. I can't ask him now. Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. I just haven't really thought about it very much, so I guess maybe I shouldn't answer it until I thought more about it. What is my favorite non-domestic animal? Well, my favorite domestic animal is definitely my cats. My favorite non-domestic animal. When I was a kid, I really liked cheetahs and peregrine falcons. Maybe wolves. Maybe wolves. Wolves.
I could see you. Yeah, I don't know. There's something about your persona or something that makes you look like a wolf. Okay. All right. I don't see any other questions, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. We went 45 minutes. Thank you so much, Dustin, for coming on for whatever number of time this is. I really appreciate it. Oh, we got one more question. Can we do that first?
Mm-hmm.
This will be the last one. From Modern Moralist. Could we have no reasonable non-belief, but have all these benefits? Group Bible studies, missions, apologetics, arguments. Children have long known their parents, but later take, I guess he couldn't fit it all in. So I think you get the idea behind the question.
Yeah. It seems to me that you could in like an ideal world, right? So if the thought is we have responsibility for one another, and everybody coming to knowledge of the truth, et cetera, depends upon everybody appropriately exercising responsibility. Yeah, you could have a world where there was no reasonable non-belief, because everybody had been exercising their responsibility appropriately this whole time and was continuing to do so. And so then there would still be the responsibility, because the fact that people currently were not reasonable non-believers was contingent on its existence from ongoing and previous good, responsible acts. It's just that that's not the world we live in, because people do bad stuff.
Okay.
Premise: people do bad stuff. That's no one has objected to that one. So. Yeah,
that seems like a similar. This you could do something similar to planning his type of move when Mackie talks about this like perfect world. Like, well, it was logically possible that everyone always did the right thing, so why didn't God, if he can do anything logically possible?
If it's possible but not up to God, but I freely do. Yeah, it's possible that we all do the right thing, but God can't ensure that we all freely do the right thing, because then it wouldn't be free. Then there would be maybe a possible world like that, but it wouldn't, in Plantinga's terminology, be feasible. It wouldn't be one that God could bring about without our cooperation, which is not always forthcoming.
Okay. Well, cool. Thank you so much, Dustin, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for watching. I'll mention this. So this interview, think of it kind of like, I guess, part one of maybe like going more in depth on a particular response. Part two is going to be with Andrew Cullison. He is a professor at the University of Cincinnati now, I believe. And I've already done the interview, so I'm going to premiere it in 1 week. And he has this paper, which I think I'm right when I say this. I thought I found an article somewhere where Schellenberg mentioned him as one of the best responses Schellenberg's seen to his argument. So, and there's not just one response in that interview with Dr. Colston. He gives 2 responses. And so I'll encourage you to go check that out. We go more in depth into those particular responses. And then for a broad overview of Divine Hiddenness, check out my interview with Dr. Daniel Speak. He gives several responses. I feel like if you watch the interview with Daniel Speak, this one, the one with Andrew Cullison, you'll have a good sense of moves that theists make in response to the argument. All right. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.